The story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self. Hi, everyone. I'm Vipin, and I'm here with my Upbuild partners, Rasanath and Michael.
Hey, Vipin.
Hey, Vipin.
It's really nice to be here with you.
It's great to be with both of you. Yesterday, we were blessed to spend some time as a team with one of our spiritual teachers, someone who's inspired our mission at Upbuild, Sacinandana Swami. And he shared a lot of wisdom with us. And he made one comment in passing that really inspired what I wanted to talk with you both about this morning. And he said, quote, "I sometimes get into this trap that I define my value by what I produce and how my product is validated by others. I sometimes get into this trap that I define my value by what I produce and how my product is validated by others." And the word that struck me was sometimes, because I am always in this trap. In fact, I don't think I experience a single moment when I'm not defining my value by what I produce and how my various products are being validated by others. And work is the obvious place where this happens, but this extends far beyond work. It includes the opinions that I produce and share with my wife every evening, even on things I have no basis for having an opinion on in the first place. And it includes the products of my products, such as the achievements of my kids. I noticed yesterday, my son came home from chess club, and every time he comes home, they notate their matches. So every Wednesday he comes home from chess club, he plays a match with another one of the kids in chess club. And I noticed that I pick up his sheet, and at the top it says who was black and who was white. And so I look at that first, and at the bottom, it has a check mark on whether black won or white won. And I noticed I look at the top, and then I look at the bottom, and I see that my son was white, and there was a check mark by white won. And I just sort of had this feeling of, very good. I can move on. I didn't even know it was like check. I was like, I had received a check. My products are being validated. The products of my products are being validated. So before I ask my first question, which is, what's the trap here? What's the trap? Would either of you like to confess anything about how you define your value?
There are so many examples. As you said, work is the obvious one. And we've talked on other podcasts about how compensation, job title are all measures that I use to define my self-worth. But beyond work, and I was thinking about this very recently, status is one of the ways that I use most frequently and often unconsciously to define my self-worth. A lot of airlines will offer status for what level, how much you've flown with them, and therefore what kind of access you have. And that's actually a big one for me. I had two recent flying experiences, one on an airline where I don't have any status, and one where I do have status. And I got that a long time ago when I used to fly a lot for work, and I've been able to keep it over the years. And I remember having a distinctly different experience. Like I really felt like the odd man out in the experience of where I was flying on an airline without status. There was something missing. The other example that I was thinking about was an example from college. There were a couple of guys who are my age who started taking up this rap hobby, this music rap hobby, where they would After being out all night, they would go back to one of their apartments and they would start rapping with one another. And it became like the cool thing to do. And we were a group of guys who were mainly focused on sports and business and things like that. Music was not really one of our areas of expertise. And yet these guys became the center of the social scene at a certain time of the evening because of their skills in rapping. And I did not have those skills. And I remember feeling distinctly left out. I did not have this status that I so badly desired. It made me really want to get better at rapping, but it wasn't because I actually liked rapping. It was just because I wanted the status that these guys seemed to have.
And that's great. So you were not producing a product that was being validated by others.
Exactly.
Thank you for sharing both of those. Rasanath, anything that you would share on this before we get into the trap?
I think it's happening real time. And as Vipin, you were sharing examples of places where you experience the pinch of being productive and valuable. As you were giving your examples, I was actually hoping that you wouldn't give certain examples in certain areas of life, because that's where I felt I will show up with my value in this conversation. And I started experiencing, as I heard you speak, and then I heard Michael speak, I started experiencing a sense of feeling a little restless, searching for what I can add that would be valuable. And I was starting to feel nervous and fidgety. I don't know if you observed it, but I was really fidgety. And then I had to look at why am I experiencing this? And it's like, well, it's happening real time. It is happening real time for me. And that, I think, underscores the point that it's always existing.
Yeah.
And we just don't know how to step out of that. And to me, there is some truth here. This exists for a reason. I think we all want to be valued, because value is a way in which we experience love. Yet, I think our pursuit of that value and how we approach it on a day-to-day basis is so much filled with neurosis that it is very, very stressful. And I experienced that stress in the last 10 minutes.
I really appreciate you bringing us to the present moment like that. And I did not notice your fidgeting because I was really engrossed with Michael's stories. So I can say I did not notice that, but I experience what you shared all of the time. And this idea of like, well, what am I going to produce here in this podcast, in this moment that will be of value? That's really helpful to bring us into that. And what you said about love, there's a reason behind it. One thing you said was that you're experiencing this all the time. We're experiencing this all the time. And when we were talking about this idea for this podcast yesterday, we said, well, we've talked about detangling self-worth from our achievements. And I was just listening this morning to the podcast that Michael and Hari did about his experience at Goldman Sachs and the self-worth tied in there. And at the same time, I think we could have 100 conversations about this and still uncover new dimensions because it's so ever present. How am I measuring my worth? How am I measuring my life? So I want to ask the question that Sacinandana Swami led with, which is, I sometimes get into this trap. And why does he call it a trap? We're saying that this is happening all of the time and there's some insecurity around it and we want but what is the nature of the trap here?
What I experience as a trap, and this goes back to what I shared earlier about how it's happening all the time and I don't know how to stop myself from it. Because the sense of self-worth, in this world at least, actually comes from a lot of what we do, how people see us, the appreciation that we receive. And when my identity is all built on top of that, every time it doesn't come, I don't really think about all the accolades, all the appreciation that I have received in the past. Somehow, when it doesn't come in the present, it creates such a sense of self-doubt about myself that now what I have to do is solve for that self-doubt. And that is what every moment is for me. That self-doubt is so deep and so fundamental that when something doesn't validate my sense of worth, the whole of doubt that I actually fall into is so deep that now I have to solve for it, which is why it keeps me preoccupied with proving that I'm indeed worth who I am or who I think I am. And I can never really get away from constantly trying to prove that to myself and first to other people. And if other people see that, then I can prove to myself that I'm indeed worth. So the trap here is the whole of self-doubt that I already come with, experience, and I'm looking at every experience in my life as somehow trying to fill that hole of self-doubt. And when that doesn't happen, I have to play the game to fill it. I stay in that hole.
The other thing is that when we do get it, so Rasanath, you just shared what happens when we don't get what we want. When we do get it, we're never really satisfied. And we've all had this experience. I mean, we get silver status on the airline and we want gold status. And we get gold status and we want platinum status, and we get platinum status. Okay, then the private jet, that's what's next, the bigger private jet. It's a never ending game. Vipin, you shared the experience of your son coming home with a check next to his team for winning chess. Is that going to last very long? Is that sense of self-worth that you got going to last more than probably a couple of seconds afterwards? Probably not. Certainly it will restart the next day when he comes home with a new result about whether his team won or lost. And it just goes to show how flimsy all of this is. We can't rely on it as valid indicators of how much we are actually worth.
It reminds me of an old tale of this person. It's a poor man who's actually walking through the forest, and he meets this mystical being, and the mystical being asks him, why does he look so sad? And he says that, well, because I don't have wealth. And so the mystical being says, I will give you 7 pots of gold. But the only condition is that the 7th pot will only be half full. So he gets the 7 pots of gold. And now this poor man, his preoccupation becomes, well, how do I fill that 7th pot? Because it's 6.5 pots. It bothers him that it's not full. So now he works really hard to fill that 7th pot. But every time he starts filling that with coins that come from his hard work in the fields, somehow the next day he opens that particular pot and he sees it's still on the same level. And so now his life becomes even more miserable than what it was before he had those 7 pots. I remember reading the story when I was very, very young. And when I think about what I experience on a day-to-day basis around the sense of self-worth, it feels like that I'm trying to fill a pot that will never be full.
That's a really powerful metaphor. And I was thinking about the 8th grade algebra geometry came into my mind, and thinking about like the graph of an asymptotic function that just keeps getting closer and closer to the line, but can never actually reach the line. And so I'm always at 6.5. Like you said, there's some self-doubt that I'm trying to fill. And so it may have different forms from one day to the next, but there's always something that doesn't feel complete that I'm then trying to fill with coins. And yeah, it's continuous. It's ever present.
And also there is this unconscious story around going back to what you said, Michael, about how short-lived some of those accolades or sense of productivity, all of those instances or events are. because it's like, where does it really go when we get the appreciation, when we get the validation? It's more a sense of relief than a sense of like actually being filled. When we get that, it's like, thankfully, today, somehow that hole of self-doubt was filled. And it's a sense of relief more than a sense of joy. And it's interesting that the next day I show up again with a deficit. So again, it's a sense of relief. What I experience even when I get those accolades is more a sense of relief than an actual sense of, wow, this is amazing. I feel fulfilled.
Rasanath, you'd said a little earlier that the starting point is that we define ourselves, our value, who we are, most often by what we do and what we produce. How else can we define our value? It's so natural to define it in this way that we don't know any other way. So to get out of that trap, it seems that you have to find a different measure for our value. And I'm curious, what are the alternatives here?
One thing that immediately comes to mind, and I must say that this problem is a spiritual problem, because what we are looking for ultimately as a sense of our own value is our deeper sense of identity, who I am, and how does who I am actually fit in and affect and impact the world that I live in. At the end of the day, value is a substitute for deeper meaning that we are looking for in the role that we play in this world and how that actually impacts the world. So what we're looking for deep down is something that's very innate to our human self. So one of the ways that I think, and there are multiple ways in which we can start to go deeper, closer to our sense of true identity. But one of the ways that I have found where we can talk about the sense of value more deeply is through our values. Our values are not about productivity. Our values are a deeper sense of what we value in this world. And values are also a deeper sense of the principles that we conduct our life based on those principles. And that starts to give a deeper sense of who I am. So to me, one thing that immediately comes to mind is, what are my core values? And am I living them on a day-to-day basis? That would be a very interesting way to live life.
Yeah, so I just want to reflect back a couple of things that I heard from you. One, that sort of my search for my value is a substitute for deeper meaning. And if I were connected to deeper meaning and purpose, then I would be less fixated on my value as a function of what I produce.
Yes. Now, what may happen is I may still be very aware and very intentional about, am I living my values, right? And it's a good thing to look at. How am I showing up in my relationships, in my day-to-day interactions, even with someone that I don't know? Am I showing up from a place of my deeper values? So whether you call it fixation or whether you call it focus, there is still an intensity that we bring to how we look at how we show up. What happens when we depart from that is, as you said, we are more fixated on what we produce and how that world values what we produce versus a deeper sense of, well, how am I showing up for people? Even when sometimes we see that we may not be able to produce a certain result. Like I see this happen all the time when I work with my 2.5-year-old and I can't entertain her the way she wants to be entertained at a certain point. Then I sense that, well, I'm showing up trying to be fully present. Even when I can't solve her problem, even when she's throwing a tantrum, I may not get the result that I want. But when I learn to focus on, well, am I really showing up with kindness, with empathy, with a sense of like, I'm ready to put aside everything else to really be fully present, somehow the experience shifts. And even when I can't produce the result that I want to produce, there is a sense of fulfillment in the attempt to much more deeply connect with my daughter at that point in time.
Yeah. So the second thing that I was going to reflect on is this point you're making about values versus value. It's interesting because in coaching, this is an exercise that we often work with people on, which is clearly defining their values, making them very explicit, writing them down, looking at where those values are being honored and where they're being stepped on. And I would say 99.9% of us, if you asked us about our values, we could do some hand waving and come up with things on the spot, but we haven't been explicit about that. And it's very different when we are so in the absence of that. Of course, I default to measuring my worth by how the external world does that. And then the external world measures that by what I produce. And so I need a stronger internal barometer in order to even start to unpeel myself from the external measures of value and worth.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's clear we're not saying that productivity is bad. A coaching client was just sharing this with me. He had read the book 4,000 Weeks recently. And in that book, they talk about this concept of pathologic productivity. And so in our last session, we were breaking down this term, and he was sharing that he feels that he is very much driven by pathologic productivity. And so it's not the productivity part of that phrase that's the problem. It's the pathologic part of that phrase that's the problem, that we're so obsessed with being efficient and producing more and getting stuff done because we feel like we need to fill the hole of self-worth so that we can feel like we are good enough. And as a result, we don't live as closely aligned with our values. And this is not just relevant for type A people like me who love to get their inbox down to zero. This is relevant for anyone who bases their self-worth on external stuff.
Very helpful. And I was thinking about in Sacinandana Swami's shoes, he was sharing that he has this big seminar that he is giving today. And I was thinking that's what he's producing and associating his value with how is that seminar going to be received by the hundreds of people who are going to be in attendance. And of course, he cares deeply about how that seminar is received. He's putting a lot of work into that. So how do we put such effort into things that matter and that are aligned with our values, but then still disentangle ourselves from seeing my worth in how it is received? It's confusing because at the same time, of course, everything I'm doing, I put a lot of effort into, and I want it to go well. I want it to be superlatively successful. I don't know how another way to approach that. And how would Sacinandana Swami approach that?
I think actually that's the perfect example because he is very focused on the results of that seminar. But the question is, why is he so focused on the results? For most of us, we go in preparing for such a thing because we want to impress. We want to have the best seminar that we've ever had so that people come up to us afterwards and say, wow, that's amazing. That was amazing. And the implication being you're amazing because you put that together. But I think from him and from knowing him, I actually feel very confident about this, that the reason why he cares so much about the results of that seminar is because he understands what's possible for people if they're able to take in the lessons of his seminar. He understands that people will have life-shifting insights as a result of what he shares in that seminar. And he's so caring and so loving and so generous that that's what he wants more than that's awesome. And in order to get that, he needs to be focused on the results of that seminar.
That was very beautifully explained. I just wanted to state that he understands the value of what he is about to give. He has experienced the value of what he's about to give. And what he wants to make sure is that the value of what he's about to give is experienced by the audience as he experiences it. And there's such a deep desire to serve the audience in that fashion that I'm making sure that I really understand the audience so that I can convey the value of what I'm about to give as I experience it, and they can experience it in the same way. So it is not about me. And also in this case, I don't think he doubts the value of the product he's about to give because he experiences it so deeply. What he is very concerned about is people may miss the value of the product. And I have to make sure that I can really convey it so that people don't miss it.
Vipin, you had also shared yesterday when we were talking about some ideas for this about how we often base our self-worth on after dinner with our partner. How many dishes did I do, or how often each week did I do the dishes? And I think we can ask ourselves in those moments, because if we take the initiative and do the dishes a lot and it's really of service to the other person, that's a beautiful thing. And I think that does give us worth. But when we're using it, when we're objectifying that experience and objectifying the other person by doing the dishes and then feeling some relative victory over the other person, that we can say, you know, I'm better than you, or now you owe me. When we are in search of self-worth, we usually end up going about it wrong. But when we're in search of offering something to somebody else or serving somebody else, and the byproduct is that we get self-worth, that feels like we're more on the right track.
Yeah. And the confusing thing, as Rasanath pointed out a few moments ago, is it can look very similar as an outside observer. This is something that's happening internally more than, I mean, you can have a sense, it can leak out, but that's really an internal journey. And, you know, one of the things that Sacinandana Swami then mentioned a little bit later in that same part of our conversation, he said, but if you're really embedded in a greater mission, greater context, you become not so vulnerable to this trap, and you're protected, in fact. And to me, that goes to this idea of being connected to something. What I think he meant by that, what I understood him to mean, is that you're connected to something bigger than yourself. And then my fixation on me and my value and my worth here becomes subsumed by a larger mission. And this goes also to Rasanath, your point earlier about meaning, the search for meaning and purpose. And then he was talking about upbuild specifically as an example. If you can think of upbuild like this, that yes, we want to serve our community and help bring them forward on their journeys and continue to create this wonderful community spirit, you will have this inexhaustible holding context, he called it, where we are held and maintained and supplied. And one of the things we were talking about afterwards is even within that context, which is an extremely resourceful container, we still search for our value by what we produce. I mean, I was thinking this morning that every quarter when we send out our invoices, I also am checking in on how much value, how much income am I helping to generate for upbuild relative to what I am taking. And when that numerator is greater and greater by a larger margin, then I feel like, okay, my value is there. And so even in that context, it's so hard. Well, how do you do this? Yeah. How can we even do this at upbuild?
That's a very powerful question. And I think it refines how we see this. And my experience is that it doesn't mean that as soon as we start serving a mission, that the inertia of how we have looked for our value changes. I see that many times when you start to serve a mission, at least in the beginning, the inertia of searching for my own value is much bigger than my service for the mission. But what is interesting is that a shift has occurred where a small part of me is now saying that I'm going to discover my value in a more meaningful way by connecting myself to a mission. Right. So it's just like there is a one-person shift. And what is important here is to slowly start to increase that, where our sense of value gradually in time starts to become more subservient to the mission that we are actually serving and how we are showing up to serve that mission. And that definitely takes time. So I feel like I have personally experienced that with Upbuild over the years, both because of the mission and because of the company that I have obtained in serving as a part of this mission, that the shift has started to occur. And this is why I feel like the association, the community at Upbuild is so critical, because even when I express the doubts that Vipin, you so sincerely expressed, I know what my colleagues are going to tell me. I know if I talk to our partner, Hari, he will say, well, that's not how I see it. That's not how I see it. Here you go. Like, look at your sense of contribution. Look at the impact that has been created. Suddenly there is a new orientation to how I see myself suddenly through the eyes of the mission. So it's twofold for me. One is the fact that I have begun to serve a mission that's higher than myself. And that's the shift. And at some point in time, the balance starts to tilt on the other side. Right. But how the balance tilts on the other side, in my experience, is having those mirrors in our life. And those will be few and far in between. Having those mirrors in our life who actually see us for how we show up and the impact of how we show up more than, how much revenue you're bringing in. And when that gets reinforced time and time and time again, then internally we begin to see ourselves through the eyes of those individuals.
We also need reminders. I mean, I experienced this just before we were starting to record this podcast. I was definitely feeling a little nervous energy going in. I wanted to make sure that I had something wise to offer and to say, and wanted to impress you guys and our audience to some degree. And then right before we started recording, as is our custom in our team, we said a little prayer. And I think for all of us, what we use that prayer time to do is to orient ourselves towards the deeper reason why we're here. And so maybe that's a prayer before you start to engage in work or whatever value producing service you're about to do. Or maybe it's a little yellow sticky pad on your desk just to remind you, or there's countless other ways to do this, but none of us are above needing constant reminders for this.
Thank you both. This idea of inertia really resonates with me as a shift for myself of pre-Upbuild to Upbuild. It's like a car that was driving at 60 miles an hour. And even after I take my foot off the accelerator, it still has many hundreds of feet to go before it comes to a stop. And that mirrors kind of my own experience where I do feel different about my value today as it relates to what I produce than I maybe did 5 years ago. But it's still there. It's still present. And like you said, I mean, it's present every day. It's present in this podcast, Rasanath. But it is shifting. And I have faith that it will keep shifting more and more. In closing, what I wanted to bring up was, I said in the very beginning, Sacinandana Swami used the words, I sometimes fall into this trap. And I shared that I am always in this trap. And so I want to leave our audience with just some really actionable takeaways here about the journey from always to sometimes. And I think just to reflect back a few things that I'm taking away from this conversation, and then I'd love for both of you to add anything else. One is to define our values very explicitly. And in our coaching, we go through the process of defining what those values are, ranking them, and then scoring how we're honoring them and being always present to that and revisiting those values at frequent intervals to make sure how are we living in accordance with these values. So one is defining of our values. Two, we talked about how am I connecting to something larger than myself, a larger mission, a larger purpose. And even if that's not happening right now in my life, and that doesn't have to be at work, that is in my life, that is in my family, that is in my community, but being connected to a larger mission and purpose. The third thing we talked about is association. Like, who am I surrounding myself with that helps to mirror my value in a way that's not dependent on my products, on what I'm producing? And finding communities that help us see ourselves more clearly. And then the fourth thing, Michael, you raised here in the end was reminders. How do we have reminders? And that can be in the people around us or in rituals that we have, in Post-it notes that we keep nearby, but reminders of how will I measure my life? How will I measure my worth? And this could be even reminders of our values and having that be really front and center. So those are four things that are immediately coming to me top of mind on this journey from always to sometimes. Is there anything that you both would add to that in closing?
The only thing that I would add to that is keeping in mind and really thinking about the fact that we have pursued so many times productivity, and we have to lose faith in our old ways of being. And the best way I can say that is we know where it has led us. If we are honest to ourselves, we can say, well, I'm still dissatisfied after having done so much of that. I find myself dissatisfied every single day. And that discontent and that honesty around that will hopefully provide the impetus to find a new way of being. That I think is very important, very crucial for this journey as well.
The key to the trap that we find ourselves in is to actually be in touch with the distress and the suffering of it, so that we are actually in search of another way, another measure.
Why are we looking for self-worth? As Rasanath shared in the beginning, we want love. We want to feel like we belong and that we have a reason for being on this planet. These are very existential questions. And so if we have that as our ultimate goal, then productivity is just a means to an end. But if we're able to have that, like if we're able to put aside the need to be productive and just go for the love directly, then let us do that. So if I'm faced with this choice of, do I, I've been working all day, do I work an extra 30 minutes, or do I go outside and, take a walk with my partner or my kid and love them directly as it possibly can be?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, the focus on what I produce is a distortion of what I'm really looking for. And so if we can be aware at those moments, oh, there I go again, searching for love in all the wrong places. This has been so helpful. Thank you both. We're going to come back to this topic because I need to make this car stop for myself. And so I need your help in doing so. And I really appreciate all of the wisdom you both shared. So thank you so much for this conversation. And I look forward to much more to come.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Such a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.